In case you're wondering, this is a little different because we began our class on Revelation last Sunday morning. And we had several people who aren't able to attend the class for various reasons. Some of our school teachers, our Sunday school teachers aren't able to be here in the class. Some of our greeters aren't able to be back here. And so we had a lot of people come up to me afterwards and ask, is there any way you can tape this or record it or something so they could listen to it? And we talked about it, thought, it might be a good idea to record it. That way we could put it up on our website for anybody that is interested in this study through the book of Revelation that's not able to be here. And so Daniel and I decided that we would stop or come together this morning and record last Sunday's class. So this is a little awkward for me, so I just ask you to bear with me as we go through the material here. I'm going to turn this air down because it's hot. Which, by the way, is a very common thing in our live class. Just want to let you know about that. But before I get started, this is the little information that I actually didn't share with the class, but since this may be going out on the internet, I wanted to go ahead and give credit where credit is due up front. I will do so later in the class, I'm sure, as I quote from these books. But I wanted to share with you two books that I'm using primarily, especially for this introductory part of the material, so that if you happen to come across these books and you read them, you might say, boy, that's just like Lance's class. Well, Lance got his material, a lot of this, from these two books. There are tons of books written on the book of Revelation. These are two newer books that have come out, both written by members of the Church of Christ. And the first one is a book by Richard Oster, Jr. Dr. Oster is a professor of New Testament at Harding School of Theology. And he wrote a book recently called 7 Congregations in a Roman Crucible. It's a commentary on Revelations 1 through 3. And then the second one is by a guy named Gregory Stevenson. Dr. Stevenson is a professor of New Testament at Rochester College, and he's written a book called A Slaughtered Lamb, Revelation and the Apocalyptic Response to Evil and Suffering. And like I said, those are two books that I'm using quite a bit, especially in this introductory material, to help us kind of lay some foundations for our study through the book of Revelation. Now, I want to begin by talking a little bit about the title of this book. This is the title in Greek, all capitals. This is the title, or actually the first word of the book of Revelation. That's where the title comes from, apocalypsis, which really means apocalypse. And this is our transliteration of that word. The A becomes A, P, P, O becomes O, K becomes a C, and on down till we get the word apocalypse. But now the question is, what does that word apocalypse mean? And typically when people think of apocalypse, and on Sunday morning when I asked this in the class, someone said end of times, someone said a big war at the end of times, and that's typically what we think of when we hear the word apocalypse. But if you look up the word apocalypse, this is Denker, and it's what they call the BDAG, or BDAG. It's a lexicon of all of the Greek words, not only in the New Testament, but also in other Greek literature of the ancient period, ancient Greek. And if you look up the word apocalypse in this book, what the definition for apocalypse is making fully known, a revelation or a disclosure. And I've heard it said that revelation really means just unveiling something, bringing something to light, clearing up something that wasn't known before. And like I asked the class Sunday morning, have you ever had a revelation? Of course, everybody laughed and chuckled, but I said, sure you have. You probably didn't think of it that way, but when you were doing algebra or junior high math or something, and there was a problem that you could not get and you couldn't get, and then all of a sudden it dawned on you how to do that problem. That is a revelation. Something has now become clear to you, and you understand it. And so John wrote this book to make something clear to his audience. And I think what was unclear to them is very similar to what's in our world today. They looked around the world and they said, this doesn't make sense. Things aren't right. Things aren't the way we expect them to be, and we don't really understand what's going on. And so the approach I want us to take as we study the book of Revelation is looking at understanding what's really going on. Because we look around the world today and we have those same questions. We don't understand why there's war the way it is, why there's violence the way it is, why bad things happen to good people, why Christians suffer. And so, we wonder about those things, and that helps. With that mindset, I think we can look at the book of Revelation and gain something for the here and now. Now, there's a lot of confusion about the book of Revelation. Again, as I said, most people, when they first hear of it, they think of a mystery. They think of something that, it's just so complicated that we can't understand it. And part of the reason for that, I think, is because so much has been put upon the book of Revelation that doesn't necessarily belong there. And the reason people have done that is because of what they call a futurist view, or a futurist interpretation of the book of Revelation. A futurist view is one that sees Revelation as a roadmap for the end of times. Something that if we read it, we're going to know, we're going to be able to tell when Christ is returning, when we see these specific events. And this is not something new. In fact, for centuries even, people have been reading the book of Revelation and seeing it as that roadmap to the end of times, and thinking then that they can somehow usher in the return of Christ, or that they are somehow involved in this end of times return of Christ. For instance, Christopher Columbus, his exploration of the New World was in some part driven by his understanding of Revelation. The new heavens, new earth, and the new discoveries would somehow usher in the return of Christ. Sir Isaac Newton believed that with his scientific discoveries and his unveiling of the world around us, that would usher in the return of Christ. David Koresh believed that his compound and the assault by and on the U.S. government was in many ways a fulfillment of the apocalyptic battle between the great beast, the political powers that be, and the faithful believers of Christ. And so he saw that as some kind of a fulfillment of the book of Revelation. And so that's the way a lot of people, that they look at it as just a view to fulfill the end of times. And with that view, a lot of things get foisted upon the book of Revelation that don't actually belong there. And I think this is where some of our confusion comes about, because we think of things when we read Revelation that aren't really in Revelation. And then we can't seem to jive all of that together. We've heard so much about the end of times and the signs of the end of times and everything that is involved with the end of times, and we just foist all of that on the book of Revelation, that before long we're confused. And so this morning I'm going to share with you a couple of these things that I think have been foisted upon the book of Revelation that aren't necessarily there. And again, this is what leads to the confusion, because we read Revelation, we have our understanding of what it should say and what it should mean, and so everything else we take, we make it fit into there. When we read the book, we make it fit our own understanding. Dr. Oster uses a story to illustrate this, a Greek story of a guy named Proscrates, and I may be mispronouncing that, but Proscrates, he had two beds in his home. He was an ancient Greek, and he had two beds in his home. One was a long bed, one was a short bed, and every passerby from his house, everybody that passed by his house, he would bring in and make them fit in one of those two beds. If the bed was too short, he just cut off their legs. If the bed was too long, he used ropes and pulleys and weights, and he stretched them out because they had to fit in one of these two beds. And I think a lot of times we read the book of Revelation that same way, where we have our understanding, we know the things that ought to be in Revelation and the things that make Revelation fit, and so we squeeze it and mold it and shape it into our understanding and our frame. And so what I want to do is for us to look at Revelation as Revelation is, without forcing anything onto it, without stretching anything out of it, but look at it as it really is. And so a couple of the things that have been foisted upon Revelation that I want to talk about this morning are things that many of us are familiar with. And Sunday morning when I asked this in class, it was very obvious that these things have been foisted upon the book of Revelation. And the first one is the Antichrist. And on Sunday morning, I asked, the class in here, I said, how many of you, when you hear the book of Revelation, automatically think of the Antichrist? And many, I'm going to guess probably 80% of the hands went up. But what's interesting is the Antichrist, the word Antichrist never even occurs in the book of Revelation. Now, it does occur in other Johnnine literature, in other books that John has written. It occurs in 1 John and in 2 John. And some people will say, well, since John wrote about it there, then that same teaching about the Antichrist that he wrote about in 1 and 2 John must be applicable to the book of Revelation. But that's not necessarily true, because there are a lot of things that John speaks about in the book of Revelation, such as the beast, the mark of the beast, the great war, and all of these things that he doesn't mention in 1 and 2 John. So the situation evidently was different, and it's not right for us to take a teaching on one thing out of one book and just plop it down into the other and say it must fit here somewhere. There's no mention of the Antichrist in the book of Revelation. Not only that, but I want to look real quickly at what John does say about the Antichrist. Because for most of us, we think of the Antichrist as some great end of times person or being that's going to arise and going to begin affecting the world in some way, leading people away from Christ. It's going to usher in that great battle of Armageddon. But look with me in 1 John chapter 2. 1 John chapter 2 in verse 18. John writes to the church and he says, "Dear children, this is the last hour. And as you have heard that the Antichrist is coming, even now many Antichrists have come." This is how we know it is the last hour. And so for John, it wasn't the understanding that there would be one great Antichrist that would arise at the end. John says the Antichrists, plural, are here already. And that's how we know that it's the end of times. And this was written even before the book of Revelation. Down in verse 22 of 1 John chapter 2, he goes on and he says, "Who is the liar? It is the man who denies that Jesus is the Christ. Such a man is the Antichrist. He denies the Father and the Son." And so John doesn't put this person of Antichrist in some far-off end-of-time realm, but he says it's someone who denies that Jesus is the Christ. If we look over in chapter 4, verse 3, John says, "But every spirit that does not acknowledge Jesus is not from God. This is the spirit of the Antichrist, which you have heard is coming, and even now is already in the world." Again, if the Antichrist was this great end times figure that would show up and usher in the return of Christ, and John says he's already there, that was 2,000 years ago. And yet The second coming of Christ had not occurred at that time. If you turn over into 2 John verse 7, John says, "Many deceivers who do not acknowledge Jesus Christ as coming in the flesh have gone out into the world. Any such person is the deceiver and the Antichrist." And so again, for John, the Antichrist was someone who denied that Jesus was the Christ, who denied that Jesus had come in the flesh, and there were many Antichrists already present. And that word, that teaching, never occurs in the book of Revelation. And so I want to kind of clear that up from the beginning. And I challenge you, go back and look through the book of Revelation, read it word for word, and see if you find the word in there. Because I know several people told me, well, I know I've seen it in there. Well, go find it and show it to me, because it's not in there. The second big theme or teaching that's hoisted upon the book of Revelation is the 1,000-year reign. Now, this does occur in the book of Revelation, but it doesn't occur as we have heard it taught for many, many years. And I want to look briefly at that. Some see, and most will, when they think of the 1,000-year reign, they think of it as an earthly reign of Christ for 1,000 years. This is, and this fits into a lot of the different understandings of end times, the premillennial, the amillennial, the postmillennial, the preterist view, and all of the different stuff that we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about in this class, because again, I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about what others think of it. I want to spend a lot of time looking at what the book actually says and understanding it from that perspective. But this is one of the major teachings that comes out of there, is the 1,000-year reign. And again, that's usually understood as an earthly reign of Jesus Christ. But I want to give you some passages of Scripture that you can look up. I'm not going to take the time to read all of these because there are several of them. But I want you to write these down, and you can go and look them up and make sure that what I'm saying is the truth. The first one is Acts chapter 2, verse 22 through 36. And that's Acts chapter 2, verse 22 through 36. Then Ephesians 1, 18 through 22. That's Ephesians 1, 18 through 22. Philippians 2, verse 5 through 11. Philippians 2, 5 through 11. Revelation chapter 12, verses 4 and 5. The last half of verse 4. Revelation 12, 4 and 5. Also look up Psalm 110, verse 1. Psalm 110, verse 1. Matthew chapter 22, verses 43 and 44. That's Matthew 22, 43 and 44. Matthew 26, the first part of verse 64. That's Matthew 26, 64. Romans 8, 34. Romans 8, 34. Hebrews 1, 13. Hebrews 1:13, and 1 Peter 3:22. 1 Peter 3:22. Now, I ask you to go back and look those up, and if you're watching this at home or even on the internet, I would encourage you to stop the DVD right now, stop the video, and go look those up, because I want you to have that as a background for what I'm about to say next. So, stop. Now you can come back. As you read those verses, what you notice is they're all verses about the enthronement of Christ, that he was taken up and seated at the right hand of God, which is his enthronement. Now, where is Christ enthroned? He's enthroned in heaven. And if you look over with me now in Revelation chapter 20, because this is where the 1,000-year reign comes up. It's only mentioned in these verses that we're going to look at, really. Revelation chapter 20, verses 2 through 7. And John says, he seized the dragon, that ancient serpent, who was the devil, or Satan, and he bound him for 1,000 years. And he threw him into the abyss, and he locked and sealed it over him to keep him from deceiving the nations any more until the 1,000 years were ended. And after that, he must be set free for a short time. I saw thrones on which were seated those who had been given the authority to judge. And I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded because of their testimony for Jesus and because of the word of God. They had not worshipped the beast or his image, and had not received his mark on their forehead or their hands. They came to life and reigned with Christ 1,000 years. The rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were ended. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy are those who have a part in the first resurrection. The second death has no power over them, but they will be priests of God and of Christ and will reign with him for 1,000 years. Now, in this text, it doesn't speak of a 1,000-year reign of Christ. Christ is reigning. He is already seated at the right hand of God in heaven, and that's where he remains forever and always enthroned, always reigning. The passage is talking about these who will reign with him, and it's them who will reign for 1,000 years, not Christ who will reign for 1,000 years. Christ reigns eternal. But those who did not worship the beast, who did not receive his mark, those who were beheaded, those are the ones who will be raised and will reign with him for that 1,000 years. And so I want us to just make sure that we understand what the text says in Revelation. Not that Christ is going to descend and dwell here on earth for 1,000 years, but that those who did not worship the beast will be called up and will reign with him where he is for 1,000 years. Now, I know some of you may say, well, but doesn't Christ descend? I mean, isn't it talked about that he will descend? And yes, it does. And in fact, next Sunday, the next class, we're actually going to be discussing the next thing that I see is imposed into the book of Revelation quite a bit, and that is the rapture. And I know some of you may say, but there is talk of a rapture in the New Testament. And I'm going to say, yes, there is. And we're going to look at that next week. But what I really, it's not just the rapture, but it's the secret rapture that has, I think, been foisted upon the book of Revelation that doesn't necessarily belong there. But I want to leave you where I left the class last Sunday and say that's what we're going to be talking about. And I'll make the same assignment to you that I made to them, and that is for you to go home this week and read through the book of Revelation and find every place in there that it speaks of the rapture, so that you'll be prepared for our discussion next week. So anyway, if you're watching this online, you have any questions, comments, anything you want to make, please feel free to post those on there, and I'll have our youth minister get back to answer all those questions for you. No, but we enjoy your comments, we enjoy your questions, anything we can do to help you. I will be praying that this study will bless you, because we live in a world that is upside down. We live in a world where there are things taking place that we don't understand. And I believe the book of Revelation can give us comfort in those times, but it can also warn us not to just go along with what's happening in our world. So until next time, thank you.